My name is Debbie Gruey with the SANS Institute, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Our featured speakers are Kyle Dickinson, SANS instructor, author, and analyst, and David Aiken, AWS Marketplace Solutions Architect. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface. We will be answering them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Kyle.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Hope you're having a wonderful day, and thank you, Debbie. So today we're going to be talking about how to conduct an investigation within AWS. And the agenda is going to look something like, one, how do we prepare for incident response, as there's components that we find within incident response that we can use to aid our investigation, and then how do we make this a cloud-specific incident response plan. From there, we'll talk about different data sources that we have available to us to conduct our investigations and incident response, covering EC2 instance metadata, and then how can we conduct what we would call a forensic acquisition. Then different use cases, and then when I'm all said and done with my thing, David is going to be talking about different use cases and success stories with conducting incident response and investigations within AWS. So everyone's favorite topic when it comes to IR is planning. And what does this look like when we go to create an incident response plan? Well, we first start with preparation. This is going to be the area where we want to evaluate what do our access controls look like, what about the tools we have available, the different types of policies our organization may have, and then love it or hate it, documentation. Documentation, you'll see, is going to play a big part in the success of an investigation when it comes to cloud services such as AWS. And then training, having the knowledge to be able to perform these types of activities is going to be paramount. I have seen in some times where organizations may not necessarily have the knowledge or know-how, but this is what we're all here doing, and this is what I'm here to hopefully enlighten you about. The next piece is identification. This is the something has happened or something has deviated from the normal in our environment. We can be alerted by this by a call to the help desk, a alert from a SIEM went off, a host-based detection that we have triggered an alert or an alarm. And this is also where we're going to begin documenting what the incident response or investigator is doing. This is so we can be able to address the who, the what, the where, the why, and the how should the evidence that we're collecting need to go to litigation or further down for others to consume. You want to be able to describe the actions that you took, the information that you discovered, so it's all attributed to what you did. And then containment. This one makes the most sense because something bad is happening. You don't want it to continue to happen. So we can do short-term containment, be it isolating the server that we have or isolating the user. And then you don't want to just delete the compromised user or compromised server or things that you're investigating. That would just be bad for business. So you want to create a backup or what we'll call a forensic image. We'll talk about how we achieve that later on, but this is where that phase would come into place. And then eradication, the removing or restoring of the affected systems. The big part here is if you do decide to clean up the system that you're investigating or that caused an incident response, when you bring it back into production in the recovery phase, you don't want it to cause another incident or another investigation. So these are the things to take into consideration. And then ultimately we have our lessons learned. What did we learn throughout this whole investigation process or our incident response? Were there knowledge gaps? Did we identify that we had a lack of capability with tools? Or did we just not know what we were doing? So how do we bring this over into AWS? So cloud-specific IR planning. So for the preparation phase, this is going to be something that you're going to want to document. What cloud service provider is being used? In this instance, we're using AWS. And then these are some new terminologies, such as what is the deployment model? So a public deployment model is, for instance, if you had a AWS account, but there was no connections back to your on-premise environment via a direct connect or a VPN, and you just have these EC2 instances, which are servers, just hanging out in an AWS account, that would be a public deployment model. Now, hybrid is going to be found in a lot of your traditional lift and shift efforts. These do have a VPN or direct connect back to your on-premise environment. Sometimes you may have these only privately routable and not accessible from the internet, almost using the cloud service provider as an extension of your data center. These are very common. Also then, what is the cloud model? Is it software as a service, platform, or infrastructure as a service? The reason why we want to understand that is based on what they call the shared responsibility model. The responsibility shifts from consumer to provider. And we're going to be focusing on infrastructure as a service for the duration of this talk, so keep that in mind as we go about. Other things to consider for preparation is, do your investigators and incident response teams have the appropriate access to do their job? There's nothing worse than having an IR team just watch on the other side of a window as a fire is burning and them not being able to do anything because they didn't have the appropriate access. Or there was something that needed to be investigated and they didn't have the tools or understand the methodologies behind it. When we talk about identification, is there unusual activity in the audit logs? And we'll cover a couple different data sources we can leverage here. Did something get misconfigured? It's very common that I have seen to where a workload can be modified without the knowledge of a team or another team member. And that could be because the new adoption of remote teams. It could also just be, an inherent accident through DevOps practices where you're failing fast and you're doing constant iterations or making changes. Did something change to the workload to then make it maybe more vulnerable or exposed? And we'll talk about the different types of audit logs you have available. Containment is the big one. I'm going to emphasize, can you disable a user's access? And I'll tell you why. If you were using a IAM user and that IAM user had access keys associated with it because they may have been doing something programmatically or through the command line, and you go to delete their access key, or we can compare it to an API key. If you delete that, you're never getting it back. And I kind of chuckle because I've done that before, so learn from my mistakes, disable the access first before you go and remove it. What about isolating the virtual machine or the subnet or the EC2 instance in this case? Do you have a method of isolating that instance? And we'll talk about how you can do that. And then how do you acquire an image? We're not going to be able to go up to AWS and say, may I pretty please have the hard drive for my EC2 instance so I can plug it into my forensic workstation that I have here in the office. Moving further down the line, with eradication, can we remove the affected systems and how do we remove and replace them? What's really nice about this phase, and especially using cloud services, is a lot of organizations are adopting what they call infrastructure as code. So the eradication and recovery process could almost be automated. If you were maintaining your infrastructure with something like CloudFormation, restore that infrastructure and you're back in business. And then ultimately, again, what were the lessons learned? What gaps did we determine? How can we close them? How did we discover them? And how can we prevent them from occurring in the future? So now we're going to go ahead and talk about the different types of data sources that we have available to us. VPC Traffic Mirroring, relatively new, and it is very unique in the sense that I joke around and say it's a span port as a service, but if we look at the service at a high level, that's what it is. AWS has extended the capability for you to be able to mirror traffic that is going to and from an EC2 instance to another target, such as a load balancer or another EC2 instance. And those can be running applications such as Saracata or Zeek, or if you have a third-party sort of network analyzing capability, you can target it to that appliance, so then you can look at your network traffic as a whole. What's also nice about this VPC mirroring is you have a couple components to it. The target, as we mentioned just a moment ago, and then the filter. So think of filters as, you know, if you're looking in Wireshark and you wanted to only look at HTTP and HTTPS traffic, you would filter that 80 and 443. These almost what I would say inline filters allow us to say, okay, we only want to receive traffic for these ports and protocols and then send it to this target instance. This allows us from the get-go to filter out all the noise that we may not necessarily be concerned about. The bonus piece of this is, since the VPC traffic mirroring is occurring at the elastic interface or the network interface of the instance, it can't be disabled or tampered with from within the host. This also allows us to modernize our different monitoring options that we have available. So with traffic mirroring, we also then have AWS CloudTrail. And CloudTrail is what I call the flight recorder of your AWS account. That's the who, what, where, when, and how did they do it. So when we look at a CloudTrail log, we have a couple components that we want to break down. The first one being, who is it that's performing the activity? So we can see if it was a role or a user that was used. And then the principal ID. Now the principal ID, we're not going to see if we were to look at the users or the roles within the console. That's something that's accessible through the CLI. But with the principal ID, think of that as kind of like a SID that you have available to you. Then you have the ARN. So who is it that did the thing? So here we have Mark the intern, and he logged into the account that we have here. And what was the actual username that he authenticated with? Going down further, the event time, Zulu, also known as UTC, is how these events are tracked. The event source, so that is how the API is called. So if we think about AWS, it's just thousands of API calls. Everything you do in the user interface is an API call. And there's different ways that an API can be invoked. And in fact, if you look at a production system, you can see that the different types of event sources could be AWS services. It could be the local sign-in, which in this case it is. It could also be internal. So another thing to look at is the event name. This is the API call that was actually executed. So since Mark the intern is just logging into the AWS account here, we see that it was a console login, and he defaulted to the US East 1 region. Now, speaking of regions, a good idea for something to look at when you're looking at these different audit events is if you are an organization that may only use one region, such as US East 1, but then all of a sudden you start seeing activity in US West 2, or maybe one of the APAC regions or EMEA regions, that would be something that would be interesting to review. That in some points, if we looked at the IR planning, could be identification as part of that process. This is defected from the normal. You may want to review that. With the numerous amounts of regions that we have, there's plenty of places to hide infrastructure, but also scale it too. We also have the source IP address, which is where the API call was initiated. So if you want to determine if someone was accessing the console or something was being performed from multiple locations, that could potentially indicate credential compromise. This is a way you can do it. And then something that's unique about these logs as well is it also tracks the user agent. If you're familiar with investigations already, user agents could be the fingerprint of the browser that someone's using, also the type of operating system. And in this case, we see here that I was using Mozilla when I was performing these activities. What's unique about the user agent, though, is that the CLI version, so the AWS command line interface, has different versions, and those will be tracked as different user agents, as well as the software development toolkit that we have available for developing processes leveraging the AWS SDK. All of those have different versions, and those will also show up as different user agents. So when conducting an investigation and looking at CloudTrail events, performing long-tail analysis and looking at what are the least common user agents in your environment can maybe dig up some interesting findings there. I've also seen that some vendors that integrate to AWS are using their own custom agent that says the vendor name, which is nice to identify, what's making this API call. Further down, since this was just Mark logging in, we don't have many request parameters other than, the console login was successful. But if the example was Mark was standing up a new server, the request parameters would show the AMI ID, which we'll talk about in a moment when we talk about instance metadata, as well as the configurations that he requested for that EC2 instance to be stood up. And then going further down, we have the event ID that corresponds with this particular event, and then the event type again. So I mentioned EC2 instance metadata. This metadata, if you've ever looked at a host-based detection tool or host-based tool, and it's installed on a EC2 instance in AWS, you may be wondering how it has the public IP address and other associated information. Well, those agents could be querying the metadata service that resides within the instance, but also this information exists outside of the instance. So AMI IDs, or Amazon Machine Images, these are unique IDs that tie what operating system or what image was used to stand up an EC2 instance. Something to keep in mind is that these AMI IDs will change based on their region as well. As an example, if you stood up Windows Server 2012 in the US East region and then stood up another in US West, those will have two different AMI IDs, but they will eventually map to the type of operating system that was stood up. Something to take into consideration, which is unique with EC2 instances, is the IAM data, or the Identity and Access Management data. You can attach instance profiles to an EC2 instance for the instance to be able to perform activities, and this is a best practice. However, if you're in your investigation and you see that a EC2 instance has an instance profile, you may want to go back and then review CloudTrail logs to see if that instance has performed actions as well. And then the instance ID. The instance ID is unique to that instance and that instance alone. I've run into scenarios where I'll receive a instance name, but that name is a free text field, so I can have Kyle's Awesome Server named multiple times across all different regions. How would I know which Kyle's Awesome Server someone was referencing? Well, we would do that by the instance ID, and I recommend instilling that into practice when communicating about EC2 instances is what is the ID of it. Then also the instance type. You can see the type of instance. Is it a CPU-heavy instance? Is it a RAM-heavy instance? Is it a GPU-heavy instance? These are all different types of sources you can add when you are creating your investigation to just make note of. And then also, does the instance have a public host name or a public IP address? Continuing further, when we look to create that backup or that image of an instance, we have a couple different steps we can take here. And this is going through from preparation to, how do we contain this, to then also how do we create an image. So when we create a security group that doesn't allow outbound traffic, that is a way we can contain the instance for short term. If you see that you need to do an investigation on an entire VPC, you can create a network ACL that would disallow all outbound traffic. Things to keep in mind is security groups by default allow all outbound traffic. So having a security group specific to isolation is something I would recommend. So if you did need to short-term contain this instance, just apply that security group, and then we'll go ahead to the next instance or the next step. Creating a snapshot. So I mentioned that we just can't go up to the AWS data center or AWS offices and say, hey, can I please have my hard drive? We create a snapshot of the EC2 instance. And from here, we can do one of two things. We can then perform a memory acquisition if that's possible. And I say if that's possible because under preparation, do we have the access that we need to actually log into the instance to perform memory acquisition? Or is this one of those instances that we haven't had access to from the get-go? It's kind of the fork in the road. If you can't perform a memory acquisition, then we'll continue with sharing the snapshot with the security account if you are using one. I recommend that security organizations within a business have their own account for security use cases such as forensic analysis and also centralizing your logging. So if we looked at the snapshot that we just took, we share it to the security account, our investigator can then create a volume from that snapshot and then mount it as read-only to a SIFT workstation. And then they can conduct their analysis to further their investigation. This is also one of those processes that I would look into how can you automate this as well to create your investigations in a much more efficient manner. But these are the steps should you need to run through them manually. So part of the preparation phase was training and strategizing, right? So we want to have game days. We want to be able to practice because hopefully we're not having to deal with investigations every single day or an incident every single day. So security should never have downtime. How do we spice things up? Well, we can create our own little doomsday scenarios. So for example, if we had an EC2 instance that's communicating to unusual destinations, being a subnet that's associated with, C2 traffic or crypto mining traffic, or, just all of a sudden this EC2 instance that is not publicly accessible is talking to the internet, that's something we want to look into. But what services do we have available to us to be able to do that? So we mentioned CloudTrail. Was something modified to permit this traffic? Was the security group modified? Did the instance have some networking modified so that it has a direct internet access connection? What about the VPC flow logs or traffic mirroring? This is the first time we brought up VPC flow logs. These are a great tool. They're very similar to if you were to do a TCP dump in the fact that you can't really export those to a PCAP for detailed analysis. So looking at traffic mirroring will provide us that bigger picture. If we see information being transferred over the line to unusual destinations, we would be able to pull that out of that PCAP to determine what data was leaving our environment. Taking an EC2 snapshot. If all of a sudden we determine that this instance was now communicating to odd destinations because it may have had some malicious software loaded onto it, creating that snapshot for us to be able to conduct analysis will help uncover that. Another use case that we could have here administrative activity is occurring from multiple IP addresses. So if we know that Mark the intern sits on the West Coast, and then all of a sudden we see activity coming from the East Coast, but we know that Mark is on lunch, could we then assume that we should contain those user credentials so we can understand what is occurring? Because all of a sudden what's happening on the East Coast is items are getting deleted. Someone's turning down servers and spinning up potentially much more expensive infrastructure. So what do we have to be able to determine that? Well, we have CloudTrail again, understand the additional activity. Based on the source IP, we could see where the activity is originating from. Identity and access management. Can we see what permissions Mark has? Is he able to create new users? If he is, look to see if new users are getting created. Look to see if other activities being performed in other regions. Temporarily disable keys or passwords that are associated with that account if you're using local users. As you can see, the opportunities are limitless when it comes to coming up with different ways to flex the investigation muscle, so to speak, and keep your knowledge sharp. So I recommend coming up with different use cases for specific to your environment. Another example could be if you know that you have only a public cloud deployment model, and the reason for that being is because you don't have a data center anymore. But then a VPN connection comes back to on-prem, that can lead for activity to pivot from what was a public cloud deployment model, which now then turned hybrid, back to your on-premise environment. The types of services we could look at there are CloudTrail, identity and access management, configuration management capabilities, and looking at other different tools. So cater your use cases and practices and dry runs to your environment and what could be unique to your environment. Because from my experience, not one environment is the same with the other. With that, I'm going to go ahead and leave it to David. Thank you very much for attending. I do appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. So let's jump through into our little diagram with some of the AWS services that can help with these security investigations. And I think Kyle's talked about some of them, so we won't labor the points too much there. But first of all, there's kind of 4 services that I want to dig into a little bit here and on the next slide. First of all, this is all about identification as well as parts of the containment and eradication steps, right? So identification, clearly without that, you're not going to get very far with some of the other things. So Kyle already mentioned VPC flow logs, CloudTrail, DNS logs, VPC traffic mirroring are all great sources of data to not only perform the identification, but also to gather that extra data to actually work out what's going on there, right? So as Kyle mentioned, you might get some sniffs in the CloudTrail log that, the naughty interns creds have been compromised and it's been accessed from different locations. But then you might want to capture a broader set of logs to actually do the investigation to make sure you're capturing the kind of full trail there. One of the cool things we released last year at reInvent was AWS Security Hub, and I've certainly talked about Security Hub quite a bit throughout these webinars, but Security Hub's really allowing you to collate all of these different alerts and findings into a single kind of consolidated view, and then perform actions on them. So you might get something where a tool's flagging that EC2 instances accessing a bad subnet or a bad destination. If you can surface that event into Security Hub, then you can actually also go take some actions on that. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So here's some of the data sources that we've pulled out there. Kyle talked a little bit about the CloudTrail logs, in that it's really giving you the API calls. So when you want to know who did what when from where, that's the CloudTrail log is going to give you that. So if you don't already have CloudTrail turned on your AWS accounts, you should just go leave right now and go turn it on, or pause the recording and go figure that out. The next data set that comes in particularly useful is the VPC flow logs, right? And this is really about traffic going from A to B. It's going to basically give you the source, the destination, the type of traffic, but it's not going to give you the actual packets. But it's really good for finding out where traffic's going, where traffic is being accepted and rejected, which is an interesting thing to be looking out. And can, if you're seeing a lot of rejects on a particular port or a particular interface, that could be a clue that someone's trying to kind of break in there. And remember, VPC flow logs are also going to get you your traffic within VPCs between instances as well, which is good for when you're trying to figure out what the impact of the possible breach might be as well. Coupling that with the VPC traffic mirroring, which gives you that kind of full capture. It essentially happens outside of the instance, and you can tell AWS to go send all of the traffic from one instance to another instance, and then set up whatever your favorite tools are on that other instance to actually run through the packets and inspect what's going on there. And then the final log that comes in pretty handy in some of these investigations is the DNS log. But this tons of info can be buried in DNS. Common one being heavy query activity to domains that aren't typically accessed and that kind of thing. So these are some of the data sources that we see being used that are native to AWS. Obviously, you've got logs and data within the OSs as well, and you may be sending those out to external tools. You've got the actual EC2 instances, the disks and the volumes, excuse me, attached to those, as well as Apache logs, OS logs, and that kind of thing. So if we kind of broaden this out, we looked a little bit at some of the AWS services, but one of the really excellent things that AWS is doing is broadening out the capabilities across security with partners such as the ones listed here, right? Palo Alto, Qualys, Symantec, Splunk, and so on. And you're probably familiar with at least some of these tools in your on-premises environments. But I want to kind of show you how these integrations can work together to help you, first of all, figure out, is there something going on, but then also help you with the containment and eradication steps on here. So down at the bottom now, we've got a few more AWS services. We've got Inspector, which can perform vulnerability scans on EC2 instances. We've got Guard Duty, which gives you this kind of all-up eyes-on protection, which you can just turn on and let it do its thing, and it's going to start looking for anomalies and things like that. And then Security Hub that we've mentioned there. I'm not going to dig too much into those because there's plenty of other material around that. But one of the key kind of components that ties things together here is Security Hub. So let's kind of walk through a couple of examples here. So let's say you've got one of the tools on the left-hand side there. Maybe it's CrowdStrike or maybe Palo Alto's giving you some indication that there's an EC2 instance with public ports open that shouldn't have public ports open. As well as Palo Alto being able to figure out alerts and things itself, it could also project those findings into Security Hub. And then what you could do inside of Security Hub is generate some CloudWatch events, and you could be basically firing off some sort of action based on the finding. And the action could be something simple, like you could basically ping the security Slack channel and say, hey, we've got an instance that seems to be out of compliance. Here's the instance information. You should go do something with it. Or you could get fired into your SIM system, like Splunk, Sumo Logic, that kind of thing. But also, and this is where it gets really interesting, could you then fire off some automations that perform some of the steps that Kyle's been talking about in terms of grabbing hold of the instance, creating snapshots, taking note of the snapshot IDs and the volume IDs, grabbing the metadata, applying a security group to lock it down, and then cutting a ticket with all of that info in. So you've got tools like Demisto for running those kind of orchestrations there, as well as Splunk Phantom to kind of help automate that kind of thing. And if you are doing game days, one of the steps I encourage you to look at is if you're picking on a couple of scenarios, the end result for the game day should be like, could you automate at least part of the containment phases of that, right? So if you get a bad EC2 instance, is it possible to automate kind of the defense there? And a lot of modern cloud applications being deployed in kind of stateless fashion with auto-scaling capabilities, there's always a temptation just to kill off the instance. And the problem with that is you lose a lot of incredibly useful data within that instance, right? The log data may not have made it all out if you've got log forwarding set up into something like Sumo Logic or Splunk, but you're missing out on grabbing that memory dump and seeing what was actually happening inside of the instance. And quite often you can just be kind of moving the problem down the line a little bit. So, don't be tempted just to terminate the instance. Let's go grab one of them, isolate it, and then do some further forensics investigation in there. So we talked a little bit about Palo Alto, and they've got you're probably familiar with Palo Alto from networking products, firewalls, and all that kind of thing. But they do have a product called Palo Alto Networks Prisma Cloud, and if you're familiar with Redlock, that's what Palo Alto renamed the Redlock product to. And then you've got the Demisto solution as well, which can kind of run your playbooks and things. It's a SOAR platform there. So one of the key pieces to get right within cloud, and some of these third-party partner tools make it super easy to get a handle on that, is actually doing the identification, right? Where are your blind spots? Are you really keeping a handle on your public exposed EC2 instances or S3 buckets? Are you getting a good data on vulnerability exploits that might be living within your fleet? Are you doing some analysis with the traffic from suspicious IP addresses? Are you even looking for those types of things? And whilst all of the data was within those logs that we've talked about, CloudTrail, VPC flow logs, and so on, sometimes having a tool like Prisma Cloud to bring it all together and identify the risks is going to be super valuable and save your security team a lot of time in doing that identification. Palo Alto with Prisma Cloud worked with a company called Informatica, and if you haven't come across those, they're a software company that provides data integration and data management tools and services. And they actually use the Prisma Cloud with their DevOps team across multiple cloud accounts. And this is very common for not only software companies, for enterprises who are building cloud services to actually have multiple accounts. So a typical dev team might have a few dev accounts, they might have some testing accounts and QA accounts, and then finally you've got your production account. And the AWS account is a good kind of security isolation barrier for that. But the challenge there is the more accounts you have, the more logs you have, and the more log sources you have. So tools like Prisma can really help bring all of those logs together and give you this kind of alerting and identification, which is what we're talking about here, across those different accounts. Then we have Demisto, which mentioned as a SOAR platform, and this really is about what do I do when I find something? So auto remediation, integrations with other tools. You can create, repeatable runbooks and playbooks, and really automate some of these tasks, particularly, shutting down or disabling credentials, right? You can automate that. Isolating an EC2 instance, creating a snapshot, and even as far as attaching it to a SIFT instance, you can kind of go automate all of that once you figure out how to do it with the combination of the tools here as well as things like Lambda to do that kind of automation. And then, of course, Palo Alto does have firewalls, so it would be amiss not to say, one of the mitigations might be to actually go update the firewall rules to block the traffic under the bad parts of the world, or to block the incoming traffic if that's the case there. So think about automation based upon that, but also be wary about having a too heavy-handed approach, right? Well, what you don't want to do is take that instance, have some code that basically goes and wipes all your instances out, and then very, very soon you've kind of destroyed your own production environment. But do balance that out correctly. So we've got a few customers that I want to kind of talk about and how they're using some of these tools to help with their security incidents and investigations. So Pokémon, we've talked about these in the past. They run a selection of third-party tools to help with their overall security posture. They're using Sumo Logic SIM solution and using that to really detect the potential security incidents. So great use of Sumo Logic there to do the detection. But they wanted to help really a fairly small team of security analysts to keep on top of potential breaches and all that kind of thing. It's pretty usual. Your dev team's 800 people, and then you've got a 3-man security team. Go figure that. But what they wanted was a source system to go automate some of these things out. So they use a combination of the Demisto product, which is another, as I mentioned, Palo Alto tool, but a combination of Amazon SQS and Lambda for the cloud component. And basically the workflow works pretty much like, they see some bad actors trying to do some things, and rather than cut a ticket and have someone manually go investigate that, they run through some checks, and different tools are using different sources for security incidents and so on, but they basically go fire that into a queue, so they don't lose it. They have a Lambda function that picks that up and then calls into blacklist that IP and update the Palo Alto firewall on that to do the automatic blocking there. And every time you automate just some little thing like that, you're just saving a ton of time for your security team to go work on some other things. Accolade is a provider of on-demand healthcare. Ooh, every time we hear healthcare, we think regulatory requirements, PII, and that kind of thing. They were looking to broaden their technology and services, and they ended up deciding to use not data from logs, but actually they wanted to leverage the data actually on the wire. So there's a company protocol ExtraHop, which gives you basically real-time cross-tier visibility into all east-west traffic. So typically what's happening is in a network environment, you're waiting until something happens, that then gets in the log, and then you have some code that responds to the log. What they wanted to do was actually get into the wire and figure out, in real time, all things going on, and what can they do about it. And they were able to replace a couple of other systems from this, which give them about a 6% IT spend reduction there. But what they're able to do now is have a much deeper set of data around actually what's going on the network before it even hits a log. So again, they're able to answer questions like, why are non-Accolade IPs trying to access the admin page? Why is the non-US IPs trying to log in when all our customers are US based? And that kind of thing. And you can do that with logs, but this is another example of using some of this data in a more real time. And then finally, we've got Recorded Future and St. Jude's. So St. Jude's is part of the Abbott group, St. Jude's Medical. It's part of the Abbott Laboratories company, sorry. And basically, Recorded Future has a threat intelligence solution. So again, on the kind of identification side of things, what is going on, what's my vulnerabilities, what's my risks, and that kind of thing. And again, with being in the medical space, they've got a large number of employees, a lot of valuable IP that they're trying to protect, huge ecosystem of third-party vendors, and the company uses threat intelligence to enhance its overall security. So previously they had a deployment that was basically taking quite a number of sources to figure out potential bot detections, and with Recorded Future they were able to drop that down to about 6 to kind of achieve the same result of identifying a potential attack vector. Recorded Future are actually using in conjunction with Splunk as their SIM here. They also managed to reduce the exploit kit traffic down from an average of about 27 a day down to about 10 per day. So what that means is that essentially they have fewer machine rebuilds and all of the kind of burden associated with replacing kit and user systems. But it's freed up the analysts to go focus on more bigger picture threats, preventative measures, and that kind of thing. So some pretty good results there. So typically, with this type of tool, we're seeing a drop in. We're able to investigate suspicious firewall traffic reports, figure out, what the nature of this unknown traffic is doing, get a greater set of rules and policies for blocking potential bad actors, and then, just generally improve our posture on that. And again, set of great tools for the detection identification kind of phases there. So as you saw from the intro, I'm one of the solutions architects from Marketplace. One of the great things about why you might want to use Marketplace in the security space is the flexible consumption models. So typically when you're procuring software, you're buying a license for a year or buying a perpetual license or number of cores and things. But a lot of the times you want to have these tools available to spin up when you're doing some sort of investigation. So one of the cool things that Marketplace allows you to do is spin up more resources when you need them and obviously pay for them, but then also shut things off when you're not using them. So you're not investigating some activity, then you might not need all of your tools running. So great kind of a way of cutting costs and doing some cost optimization here. A lot of the tools are either SaaS or are deployed directly into your AWS account, and we've worked with the vendors to make sure that they're following the best practices for deploying their software on AWS. So you'll find a lot of these tools have CloudFormation templates and will very quickly deploy into a HA multi-AZ kind of environment. And then finally, we actually have real-life humans employed to kind of help with any issues you might have and that kind of thing. So how do you get started on some of these things? Well, first of all, go to Marketplace. We've got probably all of your favorite security solutions as well as some of the new born in the cloud kind of offerings on there. Many of these solutions have free trials or a pay-as-you-go model, which allows you to try them out and do a POC for fairly, if you're thinking about doing a game day, you could actually go deploy Splunk and Palo Alto and a few of the others and just pay for that software for the duration of the game day, which is great for figuring out, which tool sets work better with each other and all that kind of thing. And then when you do go on to purchase, you can actually extend the hourly kind of transactions into annual and multi-year contracts and save you a lot of money in some cases there. You can of course bring your own license to Marketplace as well, and this gives you flexibility because you're using the same set of images then. And then if you're working directly with, say, Palo Alto, or you're working with a partner such as Optiv maybe, and you want to do the transaction differently, and that could be a different EULA, it could be that you've negotiated different pricing. We have the capability of doing that through Marketplace as well. And you're probably wondering, well, why would I do that? Well, first of all, you get the benefit of the flexible nature of the pricing models, but also Marketplace actually integrates with budgets and cost explorer, tagging and all that kind of thing. So from a spend management point of view, you can actually get a handle on your software charges and infrastructure costs along with it as well. And then finally, different deployment methods. It's not all about deploying machine images. We do have container products. We have some SaaS services, and we have some AI models and that kind of thing on there.
Thank you so much. And that does take us to the top of the hour. Thank you very much to our speakers, Kyle and David, for your great presentation. And thanks to AWS Marketplace for sponsoring this webcast and the entire Cloud Security series.